Okay, I hope you can hear me now. Let me know. I've just gone back in and reauthorized the microphone, so hopefully you can hear me. Okay, I hope you can hear me now. Whew, okay. Way to get kicking off. It looks like it hadn't authorized microphone access. Sorry about that. Thank you so much for all of you that have hung in there. Okay, so Vicky, thank you for asking that question. I'm going to make a note and I'm going to come back to that about the foundation chain, because you are not alone in, for those on Facebook, Vicky's asked, whilst we're waiting, did anyone else try the foundation single crochet? I did the gauge swatch and the foundation is a bit longer and curls up at the end. I get exactly the same thing, and I might as well address it here while we're doing it. That's one really good reason why when you're making a gauge swatch, you need to make a bigger swatch, because things like that can often knock the gauge out. I've had so many experiences, particularly when I was new to working with the chainless foundation rows, where I've done the row and I'm like, that's way too long. And then I frogged it, pulled some rows out, and then as I work, it shrinks. So foundation rows, I also find, are always much longer. Usually I find once I start working a few rows, they will shrink down. So there's a couple of ways that you can deal with that. If it's quite noticeable once you start working in, you could try a smaller hook for the foundation row. Because of the nature of how that stitch is worked, you're pulling up your loops in a slightly different way. So your gauge is going to be different on that row. So yeah, definitely try a smaller hook, or when you kind of pull that first loop through. So when you pull that first loop through, that's kind of the the base chain that you're creating there. So you can maybe leave that a bit smaller, but it can be a bit fiddly if you're new to it. So in one way I say it will shrink in once you start working into it. If it's noticeable, if it's bothering you, or if it's, you know, significantly out, especially if you think you're going to work into the back of it. For example, with this, we had the button band, and around the neck here that will go into the back of the foundation row. So you don't want too many holes in that. So I would say the quick fix for that is going down a hook size just to make it a bit smaller. I personally massively prefer, for things like this, foundation rows, because they give you a bit more stretch. So with something that's kind of going over your head, that's fine. So I really like those for garments, especially if you're starting a garment and you have like the bottom hem. If you do a chain, because often when you're working into a chain, it can do exactly the opposite to the foundation row. It can be a lot tighter. So a lot of people go up a hook size when you're working a chain on its own. So essentially it's kind of the other side of the coin. So I hope that is helpful, Vicky. Okay, good morning, everybody. Happy Sunday. Nice to see you all. Thank you so much for joining and for bearing with me. Dawn, I see you've written invisible corners. I'm not quite sure if that relates to another comment, but let me know if that's a kind of questions. Sorry, I've got fly. Okay, if you pull sideways, the swatch looks okay-ish. You don't want to be pulling sideways, because that's going to affect your stitch gauge. But if blocking impacts it, we'll get to that. So I've got one of my swatches here that I'm just going to talk about. So in this week, just to give you an overview, I'm going to talk about swatching, measuring your swatch. I'm going to talk about blocking your swatch. I'm going to talk about stretch as well, which is something that a lot of people don't really talk about when you're, sorry, I'm just unhooking my ball of yarn from these T-pins. Are great, but they don't half get caught on things. Yeah, stretch I'm going to come to, because it's a bit of it can be a bit of an elephant in the room with crochet garments, so I'll get to that. We're also going to look about, once you've got your gauge, we're going to look about choosing which gauge from the pattern to work with. We're also going to talk about choosing your size, and then hopefully, if we've got time, we will talk a little bit about yoke. So if you swatched and got gauged, you can think about moving on to making your yoke. So here is my gauge swatch. It's a very roughly blocked gauge swatch. So I'm using this, it's a Drops Nepal, I think. It's an animal-based yarn, so it's a woolen alpaca yarn, which I think with some acrylic, but wool yarns I find are much more prone to stretch than acrylic yarns or cotton. I've made that mistake in the past. So when you're swatching and blocking your swatch and looking at the difference between your unblocked and blocked swatch, your fibre is definitely something to bear in mind. So when I worked my swatch, so I worked this with a 5.5mm hook. It was a little bit tight. So this is an Aran weight yarn. So I'm planning on making a sweater with the Aran or worsted weight pattern. So I've just printed off, this is from the sweater pattern, but it's the same in the cardigan pattern. This is basically all the different gauge options that the pattern's written for, and they're the same for both patterns. So the gauge for the Aran weight yarn is 12 stitches and 11 rows in extended single crochet. That's with a 5.5mm, which is my beloved Clover and More. Just in your comment, Dawn, I will come back to that. Give me a nudge if I don't. This is about gaps in the increases, and I'll talk about, so in the raglan increases here. So I'll talk about invisible increases. So with your gauge, this is what you're aiming for, one of these 5 gauge measurements. So I did this swatch, and actually my gauge was quite tight, and I felt that as I was working. This is quite a sort of poofy yarn. My stitches felt quite tight. I showed you the beginning of this swatch last week, and you could see it was curling, but I know that the way this yarn blocks, it will kind of change it up a bit. So I kind of wasn't too bothered. I think the gauge I worked with was something like, instead of 12 and 11, it was 13 and 12, or 12.5 and 12, you know, so it was a bit tight. I blocked this. If you've seen my little vlog, which is on YouTube, and I put a link to it in the Facebook group for those of you in Facebook, I just show a little progress update of what I've done this week. I thought that might be a fun thing to do each week when I send the Friday update, just so you can see where I've got to. So I blocked this, and very easily, this is now the correct gauge. Well, it certainly was when it was damp. And as you can see where I've pinned it, it hasn't kind of pulled against the pin. So I very gently blocked this. And when blocking, I tend to kind of, when it's damp, sort of, so I soak block this. There is a really long post on the site about blocking. So if anyone's, if you just try blocking in the search bar on my site, you'll find it if blocking's a bit, you know, a lot of people don't like it. But for garments, it's really worth blocking your swatch. There's lots of reasons why that is, mostly because you're going to wash your sweater at some point, maybe not, you know, straight away. And actually wool and, you know, crochet garments generally don't need a huge amount of washing, but as you wear and wash them, they will stretch. So one of the participants on the Facebook group was saying how their swatch was too loose, you know, and they looked at maybe kind of squishing it back into sight. And this is what I said on that comment: you can never make your gauge tighter through blocking. So, you know, short of felting something, which is not what we want to be doing here, you can make it bigger, so you can stretch your fabric out, but you kind of can't shrink it, not in any sort of sustainable way. Vicky, my gauge is 10 wide and 11 high. What yarn weight are you using, Vicky? It doesn't matter how, so you say I might have done too many rows. It doesn't matter how many rows you do. I'm going to do a quick swatch making 101. Your swatch wants to be at least 15 centimeters wide by 15 centimeters high. So many people, when they start making swatches, they look at the gauge and they make a square that's the same number of stitches and rows as given in the swatch. That's not how we want to swatch, for exactly the reason Vicky was saying in the first place. Your beginning rows and these bits of the side, and to some extent the last few rows, they're never going to be representative of what your tension is. So we need a swatch that's big enough that we can measure in different areas. So measuring was one of the things that came up. There's a few tips I have for measuring. Firstly, when you're measuring, use something solid. This is my little cute wooden ruler that I use. This is what I use in the vlog. I've also got, this is a great little gauge measure from the crochet project. It's also got so it's got inches and centimeters on one side. I know about inches and centimeters, actually. I know a lot of people, particularly in the US, like to work in inches, which is fine. What I would say is if you're measuring your if you're measuring your body, if you're measuring as you go along in inches, stick with inches. So look for 4 inches on your gauge swatch. If you're working with centimeters, work with centimeters the whole way through, because they'll both be relevant. 1 inch is 2.54 centimeters, so it's almost 2.5 centimeters. But what that means is actually 10 centimeters isn't quite 4 inches. There's a slight difference. So just stick with the same units all the way through, whichever your preferred units are. I prefer centimeters because I find it much easier to work with smaller units. So that is that. The other thing you can use, this is a little gauge measure. So what you would do, now this is only a 2 inch or 5 centimeter measure. I would maybe use this on a project where I was working with fingering weight 4-ply yarn. I wouldn't use this on a project of this size because I'd want to measure across the full 10 centimeters. So you can use a smaller one on finer yarn and then just double it. So if you're measuring in 2 centimeters, you get 10 stitches. That will be 20 stitches in 10 centimeters. Sorry if I'm now mixing my units of measure. So what you would do, the reason these are great is because you can place it on your swatch. Now, when you're measuring a swatch, always do it on a flat surface. I'm just doing it to show you. You can place it and hold it still on your swatch, and then you can count your stitches and your rows in the window that's shown. Do count half stitches or half rows if you get to them. The bigger your yarn is, the more likely you are to have parts of rows. And I always round down, is that right? Because crochet does tend to swatch. So I mean, if I was working, I think in fact the gauge for the super chunky and the chunky are both half stitches. And you've also got to count, you've got to include the space between stitches. So you can see, I don't know how well you can see, that these are like kind of little gaps between the stitches. You've got to accommodate those when you're counting. So if I start at kind of maybe sort of this side of that space, when I get to the other end, I've got to count to the other end of that space. I hope that makes sense. So that's measuring. Like I say, do it on a flat surface. Use a solid rule rather than a kind of fabric type tape measure like one of these, which I have so many tape measures, which are great for like, but they can stretch over time. So again, if you're measuring something that's 1.5 meters, this is kind of fine, but you know, just be aware that over years of use, this plastic can stretch. Yes, Lizzie, there's some beautiful gauge measures. You can get some lovely wooden ones. This is from a little British indie maker called Yarnistry. You can look them up. They're really sweet. I got it at a yarn show a while ago, and I want a 4-inch one as well because they're lovely. Okay, so the other question that came in about measuring your gauge was counting rows. So this is quite common, and a couple of people, myself included, sometimes like rows will start to blur into one. So I've got a couple of tips to help you count your rows if that's something you struggle with. First off, and I showed this in the vlog, when you're measuring your gauge, what you might find easier is to lay your rule on your thing and then take a pin. This is really useful if it's on a blocking board already. Take a pin and pop the pin in at 0 centimeters and 10 centimeters. Then you can take the ruler away. You've got your pins in a solid position. So if you're holding your ruler and counting, you might move it a little bit as you go. So popping the pins in and then counting, and I tend to use my crochet hook or the tip of a pencil to count, because it just helps me kind of, you know, point at the stitches much better. So you can do the same with rows, and when you're putting your first pin in, what I tend to do is I identify an easily visible part of the stitch, so I can kind of use that as a marker for each stitch and make sure I get to that same point when I'm counting the stitches. I hope that makes sense. The same thing with rows. And one thing I sometimes do when I'm counting rows, so I often, with something like this, I will count in double rows. So because you've got this part of a row, which is one side, and then this row here, which is the other side, you know, they look quite different on each side. So you're like, that's one row. Is that the second row, or actually this is the second row? So you might want to count in twos, so you can see it's almost like a stripe effect. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then it gives you an idea kind of how to stop and where the halfway point is. And also because you can see these look quite different lengths, so you've got one row there and then that looks really short, but if I were to flip this bit of fabric over, it would be the other way around. So you kind of need to use your judgment a little bit, you know, when going, well, is that half a row, is that a full row, so on and so forth. The other way I like to count rows sometimes is to use the little turning chains, because they produce this kind of consistent bubble. So you can see that's kind of, each one of these is, so that's the turning chain, and then here is your first stitch, and that's the turning chain, here's the first stitch. So looking at the ends of the rows, it's not quite the same on the other side because it's wrong right side, but yeah, that's another really useful way to just kind of sense check. So if you're like, if you lose one, you can, it's like a second point of checking. And again, count in different areas of your swatch, and then kind of, if there's a bit off, you can take the average. But you can see why having a larger swatch is so much more helpful. Okay, what I'm going to do now, I'm just going to take these pins out. I'm going to show you the other thing that you can get from your swatch, and that is, you can look at the drape. So last week you could see how my swatch was curling. It was, you know, quite solid, whereas this, it's got much nicer drape now. So it meets gauge, and it has, I love this sort of slightly herringbone pattern this stitch creates. It's lovely. Yeah, so I am happy to go with this. Probably, in all honesty, what I will do is to just make a note to loosen my tension a little bit as I go, not too much, but yeah, I am happy with this one. Right, I'm just gonna have a quick look at the comments. Would you always count your stitches while it's still pinned to the blocking board? My swatch shrank a little when I removed it, and I'm not sure if I'm doing it wrong. No, you're not doing it wrong, Lizzie. You're quite right. Taking it off. So this, I showed at the beginning where it was pinching. There was no pull against the pins. So I know that, you know, if like, it's still going to be the same size if I repinned that, I'm still going to get the same gauge. If you think you've blocked it quite aggressively, and it's kind of shrinking up against the pins, and you kind of get those sort of dips, I would 100% take it off, and just maybe leave it overnight, just in case there's any moisture left in it, and see if it shrinks anymore. So yeah, that's a really good question. Okay, I appreciate the value of a gentle washing, blocking before wear, especially after dragging it through life while I was making it. Yes, washing your swatch is another great point, and actually I had a question come in this week about this. I've forgotten to write down the name of the person that asked this question, but thank you for asking it. So they were swatching with acrylic yarn. They'd got got gauged, they'd given it a block, and then they chucked it in their washing machine, and the gauge had remained the same. It's like, yay, happy days. So treating your garment the way you're treating your swatch, the way you're going to treat your garment is really important. So the question was, does that mean the swatch will stay the same when the garment's put in the wash? So this is where I want to talk a bit about stretch, because although making a bigger swatch is really important, and this is a good solid size. I mean, I wrote an article for a magazine once about making garments, and I was talking about making bigger swatches. And when the article came back from they run it through a tech editor, they actually suggested making a 30 centimeter swatch. Now, that's obviously, I mean, that would be great if we could all do that, but the reality is most of us are not going to do that. This is just over 20 centimeters, I think. It's about 22 centimeters, this swatch. So I'm happy with this, and often for a big garment, I'll now make something at least this size. It's fairly easy to frog and repurpose the yarn if I need to. The issue with stretch is the way that gravity and movement act on a swatch this size is not going to be the same as they act on something. So I'm wearing the Annie Young cardigan. This is the Aran weight version of the cardigan that, as you can see, it's quite long. I can't even get to the bottom of it on tiptoes. And this is a very lightweight yarn, so it hasn't really stretched. But gravity and movement, doing that, you are going to stretch it a bit. So unless you shrink it in the wash, your garment is almost always going to get bigger. And the swatch can help you kind of mitigate a lot of that. But there's always going to be a bit more. That your actual tension will impact stretch as well. If you've got quite a loose tension, the way the stitches stretch over time will depend a bit on your tension and how tight it is in the first place. If you've got a lot of sort of almost excess yarn in the same stitch, that could potentially stretch out. One thing you can do if you really want to test it is pin this on a washing line and then kind of add some pegs with some sort of weights on the bottom and just see how much it stretches and how much it bounces back. So if I really stretch that, stretch tends to happen with this stitch particularly, it will stretch a bit that way, but it's going to stretch a lot more that way. So with crochet, stretch tends to happen between the rows more than between the stitches. It still does stretch between the stitches, which in a top-down garment is actually, you can mitigate for it. So if your row gauge is slightly off, there are ways to adjust as you work to accommodate that. To some extent, it's not the be-all and end-all, but if there's small margins, you can adjust as you go. So the answer is yes, chucking it in the washing machine and having it not change gauge is a really good sign, but it may be over time things will stretch. Most fabrics over a lot of wear kind of can go out of shape. Also, it depends how you care for your garments. I've got some old crochet cardigans that I make that I literally just chuck in the washing machine, and they have stretched over time, but I still love them. And you spent a long time making them, and it may be you want to care for them well, and there are some things I tend to care for less, and I have shrunk things as a result, so I try to be a bit more careful these days. I try to dry them flat, especially if they're quite heavy. Hanging them on a line, if they're heavy, you're going to get extra stretch. So when it's wet, certainly drying flat will help increase the life. I've also, this winter, I got one of those heated airers, which has got a big flat panel. So I'm like, that's amazing for drying my handmade goods. So that is blocking and stretch. I'm just going to check I have covered everything I wanted to in my notes. If there are any questions, drop them in the comments. I'm just going to make a note about the raglan corners. Okay, I think we're good. Okay, so the next related thing I want to go on to, always measure your blocked and unblocked size, even if it doesn't change much. Kathy, I've just seen your comment pop up. I'll come to you in a minute. Having your blocked and unblocked size gauge measurement is really useful because you know how much it is going to stretch with blocking. So if your unblocked is a bit tight, but you can get the blocked gauge easily, as you work, you kind of know how much it's gonna grow, basically. So that's a really useful piece of information to have. But Kathy says, if my row count on my gauge is short, what do I do? DK should be 13 rows and I have 10. So that means, and I always get this backwards, I just have to take a minute to think about it. So 13 rows means your row gauge is quite tight. You have 10, should be 13. I was thinking the other way around. So if you've got 10, it should be 13. It means your row gauge is much looser. So there's a couple of things you can do. If your stitch count is right, or matches. So for double knit, the stitch count, we're looking at 14 stitches and 13 rows. So you want to make your rows a bit shorter because you've got 10, you're looking for 13. So what I would do with this particular stitch is when you're working, I'm just gonna hook up some stitches so I can show you. When you're working the extended single crochet, you start essentially, the first bit of the stitch is essentially a chain and then a single crochet. So the way to shorten your rows could be to just tighten up that chain. I have a whole blog post about the golden loop, which is about how to change your gauge row height. I'm just going to work a few and then I can give you an example of how to change your gauge on this stitch. So I've just worked 3 extended into there. So when you're working, I'm just going to put my hook into the chain. I hope you can see this okay. So the first part of the stitch, you're going to pull up a loop, and I wonder if you're in the golden loop tutorial. So this first stitch that you pull up is called the golden loop, basically. And if there's Yankers, riders, and I've forgotten the third thing, but basically, depending on how high you pull up this loop here, this is a foundational part of your stitch height. So if you pull it up quite high like that, you're going to get quite a tall stitch. So if I were to complete my stitch like that, so that's a chain and then a single crochet, see, I've got quite a tall stitch. If I were to do the opposite, put it in there, keep that really close to the chain underneath, pull through and pull through, you can see I've got a much tighter stitch there and it's going to be shorter. Ideally, what you're looking for is when you pull it through, this golden loop size should be about the same height as the hook and the shaft of the hook, not this bit. So this is a tapered hook because that's my preference. But if your rows are really loose, when you work that first chain, just try pulling that working yarn a bit tighter, and then you will shorten up your rows. And it may take, a few attempts to get it right. If you really struggle with shortening your gauge, I would just try really being mindful of it as you work. We can remove a few rows from the yoke. It's easy to shorten the body in this cardigan because it's depends if you're on the sweater and the cardigan to some extent. I think from memory the sweater probably has slightly more non-increased rows, but I can't be certain of that. But what you would essentially do if you needed to shorten the yoke, which if your rows are too long, you would need to, otherwise, so this is where the yoke comes down. If your yoke's too long, it's going to come down, which means you're going to have much bigger, you probably have bicep section. And this is quite a fitted bicep, a fitted sleeve design anyway, so you might be okay. But yeah, the way I would do it, as I say, pull up that first chain part of the extended single crochet and just pull that a bit tight and see if you can get into a rhythm with that and how that affects your row height. I have a blog post which is linked to in from the Cal homepage. It's in week 3, which is about adjusting top-down garments for fit. So I do talk about the yoke length and row height in there, so you can have a look at that as well and see if any of those might work for you. But if it's really long, you can, you know, as you work, keep an eye on your measurements, and you can cut out a few of the non-increase rows. It's your first time working with gauge. Well, yay, gauge swatching. It's a really interesting process because you really start to learn what your gauge is for certain stitches. Now, I know, weirdly, my gauge for working is a fairly simple double crochet in US turns. It's quite relaxed, but for other stitches, it can be a bit tighter. So it's really interesting to see how it varies with stitches, and it just getting familiar with your own gauge and how to change it if you need to, you know, whether that's, you know, going up a hook side. The other thing I would look at with row gauge is, you know, which part of the hook you're using. I mean, if your row gauge is quite loose, then you're probably going right down. I'd be interested to know what type of hook you're using. So, you know, something like a Furls hook, for example, like this, which they're beautiful, but, you know, the shaft of the hook actually varies quite a lot. You've got kind of the basic measurement here, but it kind of increases here. So if you're like pulling your golden loop up around this section of the hook, you're going to get a much bigger loop than the kind of, this is what the my eyesight, this is a 5 millimeter. So you'll, you know, you'll get bigger than your 5 mil measurement there. So there's so many different things that can affect your gauge. You know, I find working with different hook sizes can affect it. Where I sit, if I'm on the couch, from in the car, you know, there's a lot of things that can affect it. So it's really good to know what doesn't work for you. So in terms of choosing your gauge from the pattern, obviously the idea is to try and work with the one closely. Sorry, my brain is racing ahead. It's to try and hit exact gauge. If you can't get exact gauge, you want to pick the closest gauge. And as I said earlier, I would always tend to round down. So for example, Sarah's working the double knit, and which is 14 stitches and 13 rows. If my gauge had 14.5 stitches and 13.5 rows, I'd probably be okay to go with that, because as I stretch it, that would stretch up to kind of 14 and 13. Obviously, I would try and get it right, and I know I was working on the tight side. So if you know you're working on the tight or the loose side, you can keep an eye out for these things. If I had 13 stitches instead of 14 and only 12 rows, that's going to be quite a lot bigger, you know. So if I had that with double knit, for example, I would think about either going down a hook to try and tighten it up, or looking at the Aran and worsted gauge. I think probably the closest weight classes, although in the 4-ply I've got 16 stitches and 14 rows, and there's a jump to 14, there's kind of a jump between 2 stitches. From my experience of yarn weights, I think the kind of fingering weight 4-ply and double knit, there's probably the most overlap. I mean, I've worked with 4-ply yarns that feel like double knit to me. I've also worked with Aran yarns that feel like double knit. So, you know, use the weight class as a guide, but don't get too hung up on it. If your gauge better matches a different weight class, just go with it, because you can pretty much match any gauge you want to if you go. So if your gauge is a bit loose and you keep going down hooks, you know, you can hit your 14 stitches and 13 rows, but you're going to have like a cardboard piece of fabric that nobody wants to wear. So don't get too hung up on the category names. Go with what your gauge. Make sure when you've swatched and blocked it that you really like I say, that you're really happy with how your yarn moves, that you can, just about to throw my hook on the floor, that you can kind of imagine that, you know, as a sweater sleeve or what have you. That's what matters. It matters that you love what you make. Okay, Susie, I usually have the opposite issue of Kathy with too many rows. Tried the golden loop multiple times and then it changes the gauge horizontally. To assume you mean it then changes your stitch gauge. The other thing with the golden loop that can make a difference to your gauge, and it's frustrating, don't get me wrong, and some, you know, we all crochet differently, we all hold our hook differently. This is why understanding where you crochet and also understanding how to mitigate any differences in gauge. You know, even if we hit gauge in the swatch, once we sat on the sofa or wherever, you know, making our things, we're human, we're not machines, we don't have exactly the same tension all the time. Even like the temperature, if your hand gets a bit sweaty and you get a bit more friction as the yarn runs through. This is why understanding, making sure you check where you're going as you go, which again, this is why it's useful to know your unblocked gauge, because if you've made half your yoke and you think, well, that looks a bit big, a bit small, you can check that gauge and see how it compares to your unblocked gauge of your swatch, and you can go, okay, well, I know my blocked is fine, so that's probably it's gonna stretch out, it's okay. So knowing all that stuff, you know, it is the thing that will get you through, other than being really kind of robotic about gauge, because we're not robots, we're humans. Susie, the other thing, Susie, sorry, struggling to get my words out. So the other thing to say was, the thing that can make a difference is actually the angle that you hold your hook at. So, and you might well have tried this, but you know, if you're holding your hook at an angle like that, you're going to get quite a short golden loop. If you hold your angle more at that, you know, if you hold your working yarn like that versus like that, versus, you know, the way you hold it can really influence your style. So, you know, pulling up a loop with, you know, so your hook is almost kind of perpendicular to the stitch, whether you're working like that or like that, might be helpful. But as you say, it also then changes your stitch gauge, which isn't ideal. I would say for this project, it would be more useful for you to get on a stitch gauge than row gauge, because it's quite easy to add rows if your rows are too tight. Do obviously make sure you're happy with the drape on your swatch, because if your rows are too close together, you might get a bit too much of a dense fabric. And remember, rows stretch more than stitches, so having your rows too tight, if you're not going to meet gauge, that's probably the best way to go. Okay, Diane, I'm using a 3-weight cotton, which I think is double knit weight, 4.5 hook. I had 16 stitches, went to 5.5, got 15. Not sure what to do. Okay, so 16. What was your row gauge, Diane? I'm interested to know. So because that seems quite a tight tension you've got there. I often find that when I'm working with cotton, my tension tightens up. So with the 16, I would try washing and blocking it, and cotton stretches in different ways to wools, but try blocking it and seeing the difference that has. You could think about working from the 4-ply pattern depending on what your row gauge is. That might be something you want to try. I often work 4-ply with a 4.5 hook. I think it leads to really nice drape. I think, yeah, so actually of the cardigans, the sample, which is the kind of rainbow stripy one, I'll have to wear that one next week. I used a 4mm hook, but that was a bamboo cotton blend, and that worked really well in that size. So yeah, have a think about using the fingering weight, the smallest gauge or the smallest yarn weight. Again, see what your row gauge is and see whether it's closer to one or the other. And remember, if it's too big, you can't shrink it down. So for example, if you're getting 15, that would be probably okay for the double knit. If it stretches out to 14, but that would be too loose for the fingering weight. So I hope that's helpful. Okay, I think I've talked for 45 minutes about gauge. I just want to say one thing that I think we missed at the beginning because of the sound issues. Somebody mentioned last week about comments. If you're watching on YouTube, you should be able to see that there's an option on the right where you can see the comments as they're made. Excuse me, through the thing. I just need to take a moment to cough. Yeah, so you should be able to watch the comments in time with the video on YouTube. On Facebook, I think they should just show in the replay. So I just wanted to answer that question. Okay, we're going to look at choosing size next. So in both the patterns, there should be a schematic which has the size labels. Now in the sweater pattern, I've given one size for all of the yarn weights. Basically because give or take, the finished size is about the same for the different yarn weights. The thing to take into account with the sizing at the yarn weights is the thickness of the fabric. Obviously, the thicker yarn you use, the thicker your fabric is going to become. So bear that in mind. So when you're choosing your size, don't just choose, you know, it's labeled extra small to 3 extra large. They are quite arbitrary categories. Have a look at the schematic. Have a look at the sizes of the different part of the body. So, for example, this, as I said earlier, has quite a relatively close-fitting sleeve. So this is a size small I'm wearing. I have quite chunky upper arms for somebody that's a standard size small. So there's a bit more ease in this if you have slimmer arms than I do. So look at the measurements, get your tape measure out, measure yourself, get to know your own measurements, get to know if you have narrow shoulders or broad shoulders, or you know, you're going to maybe want a bit of extra room at the bust. So in this, I've just put one button in at the top because I was kind of playing with different button options. But have a think about how you like things to fit. If you have a favourite piece of knitwear in your wardrobe that you love the fit of, go and measure the sizes on that, and then you can compare them to the sizes. In this design, there are certain measurements it's easier to change than others, so it's very straightforward to change the length because you just keep going. There are various ways you can alter the bust and the bicep. I'm going to refer you, just because I'm conscious about the time, to the blog post, which is all about adjusting top-down garments for a customized fit. There's so many different ways you could do it, and I'll talk about that more next week when we're looking at yoke, and we're going to look at the fit of yoke. But yeah, do have a look at the measurements. In the cardigan version, there's a bit more variation in the sizes for the different yarn weights, so make sure when you've chosen your yarn weight category, make sure you look at the sizes for that yarn weight and you pick it based on that. Because of the way raglans are designed, you know, it's a bit trickier. So you've only got 4 increase points in a raglan yoke. In a round yoke, you're generally increasing evenly around the whole circle. So you may, you know, I tend to have a minimum of 10 or 11 increase points around the circle. But obviously I've only got 4 with the raglan, so you've got less kind of room for maneuver with the raglan design. So yeah, the other thing to think about is the kind of ease you like. If you like your cardigans a bit oversized, you can look at the bust and, you know, go with a bust that has more positive ease. So I've put a link to ease in the in week 2's section on the Cal homepage. So if ease is something that makes you go, what? There's a really thorough piece there. But essentially, ease is the difference between the measurement of the garment and the measurement of your body. So this has a reasonable amount of ease in the body, so you can see. I found this on the web. Shush. Siri's now trying to Google ease for me. So you can see there's kind of space here, even when it's done up. I think there's about 12 to 15 centimeters ease in this. And now I can't find the buttonhole, which I literally just had. So, you know, you can see that there's a little bit of ease here. Positive ease means the garment is bigger than the body is meant to fit. Negative ease means it's smaller. So there's probably, you know, maybe an inch of ease in this sleeve for my arm. There might be more for your arm. So that's why you need to check the measurements. I've got, right, I'm just going to just take a breath and read the comments. You've got small shoulders and a large bust. So perhaps I should start with the jumper before trying the cardi. I'm not sure there's a big difference in a way, because when you split the yoke, there are ways that we can look at getting a better fit for the bust. So I've got quite small shoulders and kind of average bust and then relatively much bigger hips. That's my kind of classic pair. But when you're splitting the yoke, you can actually, you know, maybe add a few underarm chains, which will give you some more room. You can actually redistribute. You can redistribute the way the yoke is split. So the yoke is split, and I'll go over this in detail next week. But just for a bridge version, you basically fold the yoke, make underarm chains, and then it kind of folds over, joins at the underarm, and that is the kind of structure of your piece. What you can do is you can leave less stitches at the back and bring a few more to the front. You know, so if you need less room at the front, you can put those stitches to cover the bust. You can actually add some stitches if you want to add some increases specifically at the front, and I will talk about body shaping as we go on. With the cardigan, because this cardigan's a V-neck, so at the start of the yoke you start with no stitches and you actually increase at the end of the rows to get this V-neck. So if you want more bust space, you can add more increases here. That would be another kind of quite simple way to do it. So there's loads of ways to do it. Again, with the sweater, you can add increases in the front piece. You can, you know, it's really easy in the sweater to redistribute the yoke. It's a bit harder in the raglan because you've got to join at these 4 points. Otherwise, yeah, I should make that clear. In fact, with the cardigan, if you want to increase the bust, you've got to put the increase this side of the raglan seam. I hope that's making sense. I'm making the cardigan Aaron Yard, gauge was on point, very interested in the fit because I have wide shoulders and larger chest with a fairly narrow waist. So Terry, what I would do when you're looking at your size, I would make sure you get something that fits in the chest. I would check that. I would check the bicep measurement, and I would go with the chest measurement. We can look at body shaping because it's important it fits here, you know, in this upper half. We can add body shaping after the yoke split, and that is something I'm going to be talking about in the week when we look at working the body of the cardigan. So next week's we're looking at yokes, and then we're going to look at the body, then we're going to look at the sleeves, cuffs, button band, and then some finishing bits. Roaming with Rover behind as usual, but still listening. There is no behind here. There is, you know, these videos that are going to be available permanently. So like work at your own pace. I really want this to be a non-stressful crochet along, like go at your own pace. That's fine. I'm always going to be here to answer questions regardless of what stage you're at. So don't worry about being behind, and thank you for listening. Okay, any more questions on size and gauge and, you know, selecting your options? I'm just going to have a quick scroll back in case there's anything I've missed. Oh, I was going to talk about raglan corners, wasn't I? It was Dawn, it was you, wasn't it, that was asking about raglan invisible corners. So this is the raglan cardigan, and I think like you can see where the seam is. Sometimes it's easier to see on the back, so you can see this is the raglan seam, so this is where the increases go, and you can see it's not quite a right angle because it's got quite a wide neck. So if I was working this at a right angle, I'm going to have my sleeve point come over here, which is no good. you know, it's quite a sort of shallow angle on the raglan. So I think I should have checked this out, but I can't remember how many stitches you work in the raglan increase. If you're already there, Dawn, remind me if it's 2 or 3, because my brain is completely gone. But what you can do in the raglan corners, and I think the thicker the yarn, like this is quite a fuzzy yarn, so it's not got particularly high stitch definition. If I was working with something like a cotton, or I was working with a really fat yarn, you're going to get more stitch definition, so you're going to see those increases. So what I would try is the invisible increase, which I talk about on a post actually about amigurumi, my amigurumi tips, because amigurumi are often used, invisible increases are often used in amigurumi. Sorry, I just need to take a drink. So what you can do, so 2 on the edge, which is here, and is it 3 on the corners? So this will work at the edge as well as the corners. The edge probably aren't as visible if you've only got 2, but if you're working 3 stitches into one, the typical invisible increase is to work, and I hope I'm remembering this right, but it's much for muchness. One of the stitches in the back loop as you work face you, and the other stitch through both loops. So what that does is it just kind of hides the increase a little bit. If you're doing 3 stitches, this is what I often do, is I work the first one in the back loop, the second one in both loops, and the third one in the front loop. And that just sort of, it means you've only got 1 stitch going through all 3 loops, so it kind of reduces the size of the hole. If you've got, so for each, if you think about it, for each stitch you've got 2 strands of yarn going through because of where you pull up. So there's my little bit of crochet. So let's say, just pulled it under, so let's say this is work a stitch. So each time you put your hook in and you pull up a loop on the front, you can see this kind of, you get these 2 strands that go through. So if you do that 3 times, that's 6 stitches you've got in there, 6 strands, sorry, 3 stitches. So you end up with this kind of hole here. If you, let's just chain and miss view, what you can do, so there's your, so this is my front loop and that's the back loop. So if I work 1 stitch in the back loop, then 1 stitch through both loops, and then 1 stitch through the front loop, which can be a bit fiddly. That's kind of mitigated the size of the hole a little bit. So you're still going to get a hole, you're always going to get a hole, but you can see it's not as obvious as the other one. Back loop, both loops, front loops for 3. Yeah, or you could try back, both back, but because you're going to be turning this, I would kind of veer to the back, both front, or even back, front, both, you know, depending on what works for you. Because you're going to be turning it. If you do all back, then you're going to get a difference in when you turn it around. So each one might look a little bit different, but have a go, see what works for you. So do you do the same for 2? You can do. I don't think I did with this one on the edges, but if you're finding that's, you know, if you find you prefer the look of it for 2, then by all means do it. I don't think I did for this one. You know, sometimes you get in the zone with it. Yeah, so it's up to you. Okay, so I'm glad you found that useful. It's a neat little trick. I think actually, so I have a post which is again linked in the on the Cal homepage, which is all my tips for top down, which conveniently brings us onto Raglands. If you're new to not onto Raglands, onto all top downs. If you're new to making top down garments, I definitely recommend reading that post before you get started on the yoke. Some of you might still be on swatching and size choosing. Excuse me, my voice is telling me it's had enough. If you're still sort of choosing, that's fine. But as you go to work the yoke, definitely, it's called Tips for Top Down Sweaters or something. It's, I think, linked in week 3 of the Cal, which is up there already, just with some resources. There's a ton of resources for crocheting yokes, so please don't be scared about yokes. It's just like making a top-down hat, like a circle, or maybe even, kind of like a granny square, except these are very not square yokes. But, none of the techniques we use are anything more than what you'd use there. You just need to make sure you're on it with your stitches. Keep counting, especially if you're working raglan. And actually in the cardigan version, what I've done is there's a whole appendix with the number of stitches you should have on each section, on each row for each size. It's a big table, but if you're like, you've worked 10 rows down and you're like, well, I've got 15 stitches here and only 13 there, where have I gone wrong? Rather than frogging the whole thing back, you can kind of take it row by row. So the tips for top down garments is definitely one worth reading, even if you're used to it. I have a funny feeling I might address that raglan corners question in there. Apologies if I don't, but if I don't, I'll go and have a look, because I'll add it in, because it's a useful little tip for any kind of increases. It may actually be that I link to the amigurumi blog where I already mentioned that. Okay, so are there any more questions about swatching, about sizing, about starting your yokes? My plan this week is to get cracking on the yoke with this. So hopefully my plan next week is to discuss yokes. So I'm going to try and get this yoke mostly done. I'm also, so just as a quick update for the cardigan that I'm going to make. So last week I showed you the green one. This is now what that green cardie looks like. I've frogged it all. Now I haven't swatched with it yet because it still looks a little like this. So I'm going to hang this up in the bathroom for another day or so all the steam from the shower gets to it. One thing I was thinking, so I'll swatch with this when the yarn's sort of rested a little bit. All these balls are relatively loosely wound because I want to give the yarn room to kind of poof back out. The other thing I'm thinking, because I found when I was looking at the remainder of this green yarn, sorry, 1 second. Last Christmas, and if you think you're cereal whip starters, I started making another version of my elf hat, and I made it with the rest of this yarn held double. And this is just single crochet. Obviously I didn't get very far. It doesn't quite, no, still a little bit small. But I really like the look of how this yarn works up held together. Like I say, this is it's just single crochet, I'm sure of it. Yeah. So what I might do is do a swatch with this yarn held double. I've seen some amazing oh, thank you, Susie. Sue says, what a great suggestion. I never saw that before. You're a wealth of information. I've made a wealth of mistakes, Susie. This is why I know this stuff. Yeah, so I'm going to do a swatch holding this double because it's like really squishy and it might be a bit of a thicker cardigan. So this is double knit held double. So I think I'll probably end up with the chunky, a chunky weight cardie for this, but I'm liking it. So I'm gonna do a swatch in both. So probably next week I won't have started the yoke, or maybe I've done a few rows of the yoke, but I'll be demoing some yoke bits next week. So yeah, What do you think? 1 or 2 strands? Let's do a straw poll. Let me know. Drop a comment. Because I love this green. It's such a beautiful, beautiful green. And I can't wait to have a cardi to wear in it. So I think that's pretty much us done. I can't believe it's 4:05 already. I didn't mean for us to be on for so long. But hopefully you've all found that useful and you're still raring to get started with your yolks. I can't see any other questions that I've missed. I realised where I dropped the links. I'm not sure if you can see the link that I dropped in this or not. I think it might be in the YouTube and not in the Facebook comments. So I'm going to go into Facebook and just double check in there because I can see different things. Okay, if that's it, I will do a little vlog for Friday. If you're on the email list, you'll get another email update on Friday, which will just give you an idea of what we're going to talk about. I think next week, I'm going to, excuse me, I will hopefully have shifted this cough, which is driving me mental. I'm so sorry. We're going to go a bit later in the day. I think we're going to do 8 in the evening UK time, which hopefully will work for a lot more people globally. And with that, thank you, Sonia. I'm going to go and have a coughing fit. Okay, see you next week.